What is up, Flutter devs? In the last couple of videos, we've been talking about documents in Flutter. So today we're going to continue it. Wait a second. Do you see that? What is that? Is that a bird? No. A plane? No. That's Super Editor. You heard it here first. Version 0.1.0 of Super Editor is available today on pub.dev. So those of you who have been subscribed to the channel for a while, I told you earlier in the year that I was working on an open source text editor for Flutter. It turns out that I was not lying to you. So that's a plus. For those of you who aren't subscribed, why not? From what I understand, it costs you $0.00. Just go down and click that red subscribe button, and stuff like this won't be a huge surprise in the future. You'll be one of the cool kids in the know. But today is the day that we kind of make this project public. It's technically been public the entire time it's been on GitHub, but now we're going to release this very first version to pub.dev so we can get some people in the broader community to give it a try. So let's talk about where this project came from and what it is and where it's going and all those great details. Super Editor is a project that has been commissioned by a company called Superlist. Superlist identified a robust text editor as something that they really needed within the product that they're building. I also wanted that capability because I'm working on a kind of blog system using Flutter because I want to push the boundaries of Flutter into the area of documents and static content, which is, you got a feel for my thoughts on that in the last couple of videos. So both of us wanted to see this solution out there, and it makes a lot of sense to be out there as an open source public solution so that we can all kind of build up the same robust solution together instead of all of us going around implementing our own flavors and never really having a great experience. And I really want to call out what Superlist did in this scenario as an excellent example for the community at large. So Superlist came along, and by the way, I'm not representing Superlist in any way, shape, or form here. I'm an independent developer. I'm not an employee. I'm not a representative. But I built this, this editor because it was commissioned by Superlist. So Superlist really facilitated my ability to bring this to all of you. And so I want to make sure that we all appreciate that they've done that. And I think it's a great example for the broader community. Superlist needed robust document editing in a product that they're working on. And they figured, well, I guess they could devote a bunch of internal resources, internal employees and funding and all of that to build their own. But then you got to figure that if Superlist or any company were to do that, then they've implicitly accepted the forever responsibility of maintaining it. And the further you go with a project like this, the more specialized the issues become. You start dealing with things that might be at a low level of text painting and rendering. You might deal with some very weird keyboard interactions. You have to deal with the concepts of shortcuts and what happens with focus when you go into and out of document focus, and when should the document automatically receive focus. The further you go, the more nuanced these features become. And ideally, you would grab specialists in those different areas. But if you're a company that's developing something like this internally, well, that becomes very expensive, either because you have to hire the specialists or you have to give your generalist developers the time to learn those details, which is, again, very expensive. And so there's a great opportunity here for multiple sides to win, kind of a win-win-win situation. By developing an open source solution, someone like me can come in. So I'm by no means a specialist in documents or text, but I'm at least a bit of a Flutter specialist, and I have some experience having worked on the Flutter team for a couple of years. I have some experience lower down than just the application level. So I can come in and make some progress on things where maybe a typical Flutter employee won't have that experience, won't be able to move as quickly, or won't have such a clear plan for where they're going. At the same time, we build this solution out in the open where others can come in, they can find bugs so that, again, a company doesn't have to pay a QA department to go find the bugs. The community comes in, tries what we're building, says, hey, here are some issues, please fix them. The community can also come in and say, hey, we've solved problems X, Y, and Z in this way over here. Maybe you should borrow that. And then we can. So that the more the community gets involved, actually the less expensive, generally speaking, the effort becomes. And as time goes by, assuming we do a good job building a robust editor, more and more people use it, become invested in it, and then we have more support to keep it going. As the features get deeper and deeper, more and more nuanced, the people using it have experience from other areas with regard to those features. Again, thinking about weird keyboard stuff, weird text painting, all these kinds of issues that most of us don't deal with in most apps, we still need to solve those problems in this editor. So by funding an open source project, Superlist is going to solve their problem. They're going to solve many of your problems, but also by your involvement in the future, you will help further solve Superlist's problems. So this is very much an investment in the future of their project by helping to create this great, robust editor for all the rest of us. And I would love to see more companies do this. I have said for a while now that it's really important for the future of Flutter that real Flutter work find a way to be compensated. Obviously, on average, that's going to mean employment or contract development. But there's a really great opportunity in the open source world to go out and build some of these specialized solutions for everybody, to have that be a way for some of the more experienced or more specialized Flutter developers to be able to pay their bills while still providing the rest of us with tools. So again, I want to point out how great I think that decision was, and I would love to see many more companies really become a part of the Flutter community by doing something similar. And in fact, there's been another company that has commissioned work within Super Editor, and I'll talk about them in a future video, maybe even bring one of the reps from that company on for an interview. We'll see. Now, this version of the editor, I want to say up front, I mentioned it's the very first public release. It's version 0.10. There are no versions that are more unstable than this one, and hopefully there never will be. So this version of the editor is really for those of you who want to test it out, who want to prototype with it, or if you use it in a product, understand that you're going to be on the hook for the things you need that we haven't yet provided. And if a bug comes up and you have a time-sensitive requirement in your product, you may have to solve that bug. So right now, if you're going to put this into production, you need to have the personnel that are capable of doing rework on this project as needed for your product. We aren't really making any promises at this point about stability. That's the reason that is the first public release. Now, what we're trying to do with this release is first, well, we've kind of already done it, but our focus in getting to this point was kind of twofold. One, this is a proof of concept. We wanted to prove to ourselves that we could create a good production level, general purpose text editor in Flutter. We weren't sure what that would mean, how deep we'd have to go into the Flutter APIs. Would we run into limitations that just flat out prevent us from doing this? Fortunately, up to this point, we haven't run into any showstoppers. There are some areas within Flutter where we could definitely use some better support, especially on web. We'll talk about that later. But by getting to this point, without running into anything that prevents us from creating an editor, we feel pretty confident that a general purpose text editor is possible with the Flutter APIs, even as they exist today. Now, the second thing is we've had a couple of companies, as I mentioned, involved with this project, and we wanted to make sure that we delivered to those companies what they need for the current level of their product. Now, the use of Super Editor has not gone to production, at least public production, in any products yet, but it is being used in kind of closed testing for a couple products, and so far it's doing its job. So we have also proved it against a couple actual product use cases. With that, let's jump over to a little bit of a demo. Enough words. Let's go look at what the editor actually looks like and what it does. Here we have the example app for the editor. So if you clone the repository, you will be able to run this app on your host machine. Now, let's talk about platforms really quickly. We have been pretty much entirely focused on the Mac desktop experience. We have not been regularly running the example app or any tests against Windows or Linux. We have been running this against web, and we want to support web we want to support everything. Web is kind of like a secondary goal for us right now. We believe everything in here is working on web as it is working on Mac desktop, but the web is a bit more of a raw experience because there are various things like keyboard keys that they're actually not handled correctly by Flutter itself at this point. So there are some areas where you're going to run into difficulties on web, but most of that goes beyond what we've done with the editor code. Now in this editor here, you'll see I can drag to select. We have this little bar that comes up with some formatting options. So I can drag text. I can also drag across different types of content. We talked about that in the previous video. Let's look at what we can do in terms of navigation with selection. So here inside the paragraph, I can go up and down across lines. I can go left and right across characters. If I hold down the Shift key, we get a selection. We can do that in either direction. If I hold down Alt, we can go by word. If I hold down Alt and Shift, we can expand a selection by word. I can do a Command arrow key, and we're getting to the beginning and end of the line. We can select that. We can select, of course, across lines. And if I press backspace, we can delete the selected content. Then we can backspace individual characters, delete upstream or downstream characters with the delete key. If I press the arrow up from the paragraph to the horizontal rule, now the horizontal rule is selected. Then the title is selected. Then this image at the top is selected. You'll notice that we also got an auto scroll up to ensure the selected content is visible. We can go down. So here we have list items, block quotes. And again, we're auto scrolling as we go. All of these little abilities had to be built. So none of these were automatic because remember, as we talked about in the previous videos, these are not selectable text widgets. These are not editable text widgets. These are not text fields. These are not Cupertino text fields. What I had to do was go back down to render paragraph, essentially the text widget, and render paragraph and build up. So each one of these paragraphs as well. Anything that you can select, any selectable text, is actually built in this editor with a super selectable text widget. It's a new widget we've introduced. Up here, this title, super selectable text. This paragraph, super selectable text. This block quote, super selectable text. List items are a row widget with a circle container painted black over here on the left, and then a super selectable text widget. So this is a bunch of different widgets, okay? It's not text in one big widget with blank lines. It's a bunch of different widgets laid out. And that leads to versatility, of course. So not only can we throw images in here and horizontal rules, but if we wanted to, we could do something exotic like a multi-column layout if we wanted to program such a thing. Now, I showed you that we can delete text. We can also delete images. We can delete horizontal rules. We can come down to this block quote, come to the beginning, press backspace. Now it's a normal paragraph. Now it's a block quote again. Why? Because I put in a caret space, block quote. List item, same thing. I'll press backspace. Now it's a normal paragraph. I'll do an asterisk space. Now it's a list item. Come down here, the second list item, if I press backspace, not only does it go back to a paragraph, but the item below it recognizes that it's no longer, that we've now split the list in two, and the count begins again. And then if I do one dot, it'll automatically turn into a list item. I can select across content, press delete, deletes the selected content, collapses down. So you can see that fundamental document interaction is certainly possible in Flutter, and now it's available to you in the form of Super Editor. But again, it did require a lot of these kind of nuanced interactions that we all take for granted, but the moment you start creating one of these things from scratch, it doesn't exist. You have to implement it yourself, and that's what we've done. That's one of the reasons this is a proof of concept. It's also one of the reasons that the first version, it might feel like there's a lot more to do, and there certainly is, but that's because we kind of had to go rediscover all of the things we take for granted in an editor and then re-implement those ourselves. And now hopefully we can build up some momentum to bring in more and more sophisticated features. I want to show you some of the building blocks here though, 2 building blocks in particular. I told you that all the text that's selectable here is based on the super selectable text widget. If we open this drawer of demos, I'm going to go down here to super selectable text. And this example here is going to hopefully drive home a point that I made in the previous video, which is that the painting of text and the decoration of text does not need to have any connection to user interaction or gestures or the keyboard or anything. I haven't tapped on any of these pieces of text. I haven't dragged on them. I haven't interacted with them in any way. And yet you can see pretty much every variation of caret position and text selection. We can have no content with a caret. We can have content with no caret. We can have content with a caret at the end. We can have content with an upstream to downstream selection. We can have content with the downstream to upstream selection. We can have a custom color and painting applied to the selection with a different caret being drawn. And in fact, you have an opportunity with this widget to paint selection in the caret however you want. These are, I think, literally widget builders, or might even be painters. But the point is that you can substitute anything you choose in those places. So you're not limited to rectangles. You're not limited to fill colors. Whatever you want to do, you can do it. Same thing with the caret. Now, I don't think this widget provides the ability for multiple carets out of the box. So you might have to kind of build your own version of super selectable text with that capability. Maybe we'll adjust that later, or maybe we'll break out some inner parts of super selectable text to make it even more composable so you can do interesting things like that. But certainly you have far more control here over the presentation of the caret and the selection than you do with existing Flutter widgets. And again, you don't have to interact with this thing to paint a selection or paint a caret. You just tell it what's selected and you tell it how to paint the caret. Now, you'll notice that there is some bold text in here. So let's also talk about maybe the most important underpinning piece to this whole thing, which is attributed text. Attributed text is a combination of, well, attributed text is a class, a regular Dart class. It's not a widget. It's not Flutter specific necessarily. Attributed text represents textual content that has spans that are attributed. But unlike a text span, these spans can intersect each other, which is really important when you're actually manipulating styles or other attributions on text. Text span collapses everything down into just one series of spans. Let me show you the opposite of that first. So we come down in here and I start tapping on these bold controls here. You can see that it bolds the corresponding characters in the display of the attributed text. But now let's make some parts italics and let's cover the part that's also bold. From an attributed text perspective, these are just two spans. You have a continuous bold span and you have a continuous italic span. We can even throw some strike through in here. Now that's just three spans. But the text span that's required to render this actually has a number of spans. It goes from the beginning to right here where the bold, right before the bold intersects strike through, that's one span. Then where there's just bold and strike through, these three characters, that's a second span. Then where all three of these exist up to this point is a third span. Then where we just have italics and strike through, that's a fourth span. Then from italics until it disappears, that's a fifth span. And then from the point after that to the end, that's a sixth span. You have six collapsed spans, a series of six spans to render this text using a text span. But when you're doing style manipulation, that's really, you don't care about the series of spans. You typically want to toggle all the strike through on or off, all the italics on or off, all the bold on or off. And if you try to do that with a text span, you have to go through and collect all of the individual spans that happen to include any bold or any italics. Attributed text is designed to give you kind of a logical representation unrelated to rendering, where you can add and remove spans all you want and toggle spans and all that kind of stuff. Now, even below attributed text is something called attributed spans. That's a completely logical, not even based on text, representation of these spans. Those attributed text then includes attributed spans and applies it to the concept of text, which is what we're seeing here. Attributed text is then used by super selectable text. So this bold right here is a span within the attributed text that's being displayed. Then if we take super selectable text, which can paint attributed text with selection, with a caret, and we put it together in all the different layout ways we want for a document, and we add user interaction on top where we can drag. So that drag was not per selectable text. That drag was across the document. The document is what needs user interaction. But the document then coordinates between all of these different selectable, super selectable text widgets, as well as this image component here, this horizontal rule component, etc. Not only did I tell you in the last video how I would try to solve this document editing problem in Flutter, but I've actually applied that. I've put it to the test here, and it seems to work pretty well. Let's talk about what's next for this project. A big reason to release this publicly, even if this editor doesn't do everything an editor needs to do, a big reason to release it is to get early feedback on the APIs. Now, some of you who are used to kind of working with packages that are stable and the APIs are optimized and everything's documented, this is going to feel a little cryptic and sparse, and the APIs might seem a little complicated. There's not a lot of documentation to go along with this. The reason is that we expect the APIs to change. And if the APIs are going to change, if a lot of them are going to change possibly multiple times, then writing, a page of documentation for every class is really a waste of development time when we could put that time into actually getting to the correct API. So for a while, the documentation is going to be a bit sparse. Now, that said, I have aimed for as well-named classes and functions and properties as I can. Hopefully, in most cases, it's clear, but that's all part of the feedback process as well. If a bunch of people keep saying, we don't know what this means, we don't know what this means, we don't know what this means, well, that's a good indication that I should go revisit those names and those APIs. The APIs that do exist are going to seem a little bit complicated because we can kind of go about creating something like this in one of two ways. We can start specific and then broaden things out. That tends to involve a lot of breaking changes on a regular basis, and early assumptions will be made that turn out to be completely false, and you have to really rework a lot of deep details. The alternative is to try to kind of be as generic and broad as possible up front. Given that text manipulation and document rendering and editing has been around for a while, we should be able to glean most of the common behaviors that people expect. So we should be able to build a very generic basis for an editor that should accommodate most or all use cases. The downside to that approach is that we're kind of working with the fundamental building blocks, which means a lot more pieces, and you need to understand the generality of it. You may have a very simple use case for your document, but this editor needs to support somebody else's far more complicated use case. In a polished API surface, the way you deal with that is you have all of the building blocks at the bottom, but then you create a specialized interface just for the simple use case. So that for you would use the simple API, which is built on top of the building blocks, but then someone who's doing something more complicated would use those lower level pieces. Right now, for the most part, all we have are the lower level pieces. So you're going to see a bit of code that might feel like overkill. And I just want you to know the reason for that is because we're trying to support everything you want to do with a text editor. We've also only gotten to a certain level of development in terms of features. So there may be some very common things that aren't there yet. Hopefully it doesn't take you a lot of work to add something that's not there, but you might have to add something. As we get this feedback, we then want to clean up the APIs as best we can. As things begin to stabilize and bake, we will add documentation to those APIs. And of course, we want to find and fix any and every bug we can along the way. Those are the immediate goals. Beyond the immediate, looking to, the next major release, maybe 0.20, we would, I'm not sure if I mentioned this. Let's talk about platform support. I did mention that we're not targeting Linux or Windows, but this might run fine on Linux and Windows. We're mostly focused on Mac desktop for right now, secondarily focused on web. This editor does not support mobile right now. And that's because on mobile, really everything related to text manipulation uses what's called a text input client. And that was kind of a rabbit hole that we just didn't want to go down in the first release. We wanted to figure out the desktop situation. Mobile was not a priority for the companies involved up front. And mobile, again, is not typically where you're going to do this kind of document editing. However, in the next major release, we do plan to build mobile support. So we're going to figure out how to bring that text input client into this broader document editing. And then we should at least see nominal editor capabilities on all platforms: Android, iOS, Mac, Windows, Linux, and web. Beyond that, another big thing that's currently missing from this experience is undo and redo support. And that's kind of a core architectural issue. For those of you familiar with event sourcing, we essentially need to implement some kind of event-sourced representation for document manipulation. I'm still trying to figure out what a good answer to that is. If you do have any recommendations, feel free to post a proposal or link to something that we might use to influence that. But undo redo support is also something that we're hoping to get into the next major release. That's where we are with Super Editor. We're at the, again, 0.10, very first public release. We're looking to get your feedback, see how you're using it, what's working well, what isn't working well, where can you find the bugs, and hopefully sooner rather than later, we will have a very general purpose, very capable, easy to use document editor and document renderer for all Flutter developers and all Flutter apps on all platforms supported by Flutter. I'm looking forward to that future. Hopefully you are too. Please be sure to go check out the repository, run the example app, star the repository, subscribe to this video, give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you somewhere down the road.